countdown, we have the gas-resistant stroller. When you go out for a walk with the little guys right now, you might throw them in a stroller. It's probably the easiest way to get from A to B without having to wait for the little kids to catch up. They always want to stop and pick up a rock that's smooth. Like, what is it with smooth rocks that seem so cool? Anyways, back in the day when there was a concern about chemical attacks, a gas-resistant stroller was made. The gas-resistant stroller was what looks like a metal coffin on wheels. It was all the rage when mustard gas wasn't yet a war crime. It would pair nicely with a gas mask that your mom could wear as she pushed you through the streets. Honestly, it's pretty terrifying, not gonna lie. I'm glad that this isn't a thing anymore. Over to you, Rachel.
In our number 6 spot today, we have Charles Cullen. This guy used to be a nurse who took the lives of his patients throughout his career, and he may be one of the worst serial killers ever recorded. He confessed to taking the lives of 40 people, but through subsequent interviews, it became apparent that the number was way higher than 40. He just couldn't remember the names of all of them. But, of course, he could remember the details of all of his crimes against them. His crimes started in 1988 and spanned over a decade into 2003. In October of 2003, when a patient at a hospital passed away from low blood sugar, the authorities were called. This person was Charles' final victim, and authorities began looking into him and investigating his past employment history. On December 12, 2003, authorities were arresting him and charging him with only one count of his crimes, but he ended up admitting to 40. He ended up pleading guilty to his crimes and arranged a plea deal where authorities would not seek the death penalty if he cooperated. During one of his court proceedings, he continuously asked the judge to step down and apparently repeatedly chanted for 25 minutes straight, even after he was restrained and gagged for his outbursts. It is thought that his victims might be up in the 400 range, which is truly just unbelievable. In our number 5 spot today, we have John Allen Muhammad and John Lee Malvo. This pair is referred to as the DC Snipers, and they were responsible for a series of coordinated attacks during a 3-week period in October of 2002. The pair took the lives of 10 people and critically injured 3 others during this spree, although their crimes spanned even before this and involved even more people. Their crimes were random and terrifying. People would just be going about their everyday tasks when this horrific pair would strike. Through a series of quote-unquote mistakes the pair made, they were able to be caught by authorities and arrested. In September of 2003, John Allen was sentenced to death, and this sentence was carried out in November of 2009. John Lee, on the other hand, was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences, but very recently it was determined that his sentence needs to be re-looked at because of his young age when the crimes were committed. In our number 4 spot today, we have Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. A 2-for-1 of the most horrific kind, this pair was often referred to as the toolbox killers. They received this name because most of what they used to commit their crimes would be items normally stored in a household toolbox. The pair committed 5 of these crimes in Southern California over a 5-month period in 1979. In the end, what led to their capture was when Roy met up with a friend with whom he had previously been incarcerated with. He confessed to the crimes to this person in great detail, and you know what this person did? They consulted their attorney about this horrifying confession, who then advised them to go to the authorities with the information. Thank goodness. Authorities, while they didn't have the evidence necessary to charge the men with the crimes at that time, were able to, through surveillance, find other things to arrest them for, while they searched their homes to find the evidence that they really did need. The pair stood trial, and in the end, Lawrence was sentenced to death, and Roy, who accepted a plea bargain and agreed to testify against Lawrence, received a life sentence. Lawrence died of natural causes while on death row in December of 2019, as did Roy at the California Medical Facility in 2020. FBI Special Agent John E. Douglas described Lawrence as the most disturbing individual for whom he has ever created a criminal profile. In our number 3 spot today, we have Robert Hansen. Robert is often referred to as the Butcher Baker, and his story truly is horrific. He is one of the most prolific serial killers in Alaska's history because for over a decade he would kidnap women and bring them into the wilderness, where he would then stalk them like prey. The reason he got away with his crimes for so long is because outside of these horrifying crimes, he was just a soft-spoken baker. Robert was heading to church by day and prowling the streets at night. What led to the downfall of this horrible monster was a badass named Cindy Paulson, who was able to escape from Robert and was sure to leave evidence behind. She then went to authorities and told them what happened, and this led to a search warrant for Robert's property, which is where all the evidence they needed lied. Robert is believed to have taken the lives of at least 17 women, and in 1983 he was sentenced to 4 461 years and a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In our number 2 spot today, we have William Bonin. This horrible person is said to be responsible for taking the lives of 21 young men in Southern California from May of 1979 to June 1980. It is said that on at least 12 of these occasions, he was assisted by one of his 4 known accomplices, and it is even speculated that he might be responsible for 15 more of these crimes that evidence hasn't officially been able to connect him to. He was often referred to as the freeway killer because of the fact that most of the bodies were found along the freeway of Southern California. The police surveilled William until they could catch him in the act, which they did. In the beginning, he claimed innocence. I mean, they caught him in the act. It's kind of dumb to claim innocence, but after receiving an impassioned letter from one of the victim's mothers, which asked him to please share the location of her son's body, he confessed his guilt. But he made sure to clarify that it wasn't so the mother could be at peace or so that her pain could be eased. No, of course not. Instead, he said, quote, "I was dying for a hamburger and I knew if I went out with the cops, they would get me a hamburger." At his first trial, the prosecutor described him as, quote, "the most arch-evil person who ever existed." William was convicted on 14 of his crimes and was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row before his sentence was carried out in 1996. In our number 1 spot today, we have Israel Keyes. Israel is quite a prolific serial killer and truly is a terrifying person. While everyone on this list is horrible, Israel is particularly scary because of the fact that he had no MO or type. He just killed at random. In fact, he was so prepared for these random crimes that he left kill kits all over the US so that he would be prepared for whenever whoever he chose crossed his path. It isn't quite clear how many of these crimes he committed, and many missing persons reports that are still open could potentially be linked to him. It is said that Israel had a sort of admiration and obsession with other prolific serial killers like Ted Bundy or Robert Hansen, who we already talked about today. He even said, quote, "I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about. It's kind of a hobby of mine." So creepy. In March of 2012, Israel was finally apprehended and was to stand trial for his crimes, but unfortunately, while waiting for trial, he went on to take his own life. He left behind a note and a drawing of 11 skulls, which led authorities to believe that this may be the number of victims he had. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Quincy Allen. Quincy Allen is a man who went on a crime spree between July and August of 2002 where he took the lives of 4 people. His crime spree was actually inspired while he was in prison serving time for stealing a vehicle. It was here that a fellow inmate decided to start recruiting others and told him that he could get Quincy a job as a mafia hitman. When Quincy was released, he decided to buy a shotgun so he could start practicing. Man, I really wish he showed this kind of dedication to literally anything else. Quincy started off this horrific crime spree on July 7th, 2002 by attacking a 51-year-old homeless man who was sleeping at the time. Luckily, this man was able to survive the attack. His crimes continued until he was arrested on August 14th, 2002. After his arrest and trial, Quincy received a sentence of death and is still on death row awaiting execution. His sentencing did not deter him from the criminal life, however, as in 2009, Quincy, along with another inmate, planned an attack on a correctional officer at the prison they both reside at. Quincy was intended to be executed on January 8th, 2010, but there was a stay of execution that was accepted, and as of July 26th, 2022, literally just over a month ago, Quincy's death sentence was overturned. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer is one of the most famous serial killers of all time, and he managed to elude police for 30 years. From 1973 to 1986, the GSK was responsible for taking the lives of 13 people, harming 50, and 120 different burglaries all across California. Throughout the investigation process, he used different tactics to both taunt and threaten police and victims, which is just another level of being messed up. If you don't know how this story ends, buckle up though, because it is wild. So you know those like family DNA tests like 23andMe where you send in your DNA and then they send you back your genealogy? Well, basically these kinds of services helped identify who the real Golden State Killer was. In 2018, when Detective Paul Holes and FBI lawyer Steve Kramer uploaded the Golden State Killer DNA profile, which they were able to obtain from the crime scenes, to the website GED Match, they were able to find 10 to 20 people who had the same great-great-great-grandparents parents as this DNA match. From there, a genealogist made a large family tree, and then they were able to single out 2 main suspects. After covertly collecting DNA samples from one of the suspects and comparing them to the crime scene DNA, they were finally able to arrest Joseph James DeAngelo, who is the Golden State Killer. After decades of waiting, the victims of his crimes were finally able to see justice served, as he was sentenced to 12 life sentences plus 8 years. He was spared the death penalty because he admitted to numerous crimes he had perpetrated, some of which he wasn't even being charged for. He is now 75 years old and will definitely spend the rest of his life in prison. In our number 8 spot today, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, or the Son of Sam, is an American serial killer who terrorized New York from July of 1976 to July of 1977. He took the lives of 6 people and wounded 7 others, all while eluding the biggest manhunt in New York City history. He was one of those arrogant ones who leaves like little notes for the police promising to do it again, but his arrogant self was caught for his crimes, and he was arrested on August 10th, 1977 and was indicted for his crimes. He confessed to all of them and claimed that he was just obeying the orders of a demon that had manifested itself in the form of a dog that belonged to his neighbor. He was found mentally competent to stand trial, and he pleaded guilty to his crimes, which left him sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. He later admitted to making up the dog story, which yeah, duh, but he did say that he was a member of a violent satanic cult and his crimes were committed as a part of that. These claims were investigated, but no one has ever been able to confirm or deny them. In our number 7 spot today, we have Tex Watson. Tex Watson was one of the central members of the Manson family, which was led by Charles Manson, and he was a willing participant for the horrible Tate and LaBianca crimes that took place on August 9th and 10th, 1969. In October of 1969, Tex knew his arrest was coming, so he fled to his home state of Texas, but was later arrested and extradited back to California. Once he was in California, he refused to talk or eat and ended up losing 55 pounds, which got him sent to get tested to see if he was fit to stand trial, which he was. In 1971, he was convicted on 7 counts of first-degree unalive and 1 count of conspiracy to commit unalive. He originally received a death sentence, but it ended up being commuted to life in prison. Get this, you guys, though, he was able to release a book while in prison, and he got married, and through conjugal visits, he was able to have 4 children. 4 children. But thankfully in 1996 they banned those kinds of visits for people serving life in prison, and in 2003 he got divorced because his wife had met someone else. I hope so. In our number 6 spot today, we have Scott Erskine. Early in life, Scott began to commit violent crimes against others that I truly cannot even speak about here on YouTube, they're so bad. He spent 4 years in prison for one of these crimes when he was around 17 years old, but when he was paroled after the 4 years, he immediately began committing crimes again. In 1993, Scott invited a woman who was waiting for the bus into his home and ended up holding her hostage for several days. After letting her go, he was quickly arrested and ended up being sentenced to 70 years in prison. This is when he had to submit DNA to a database, and in March of 2001, that DNA was matched when the cold cases of the unsolved killings of Jonathan Sellers and Charlie Keever were reopened. In 2004, a jury sentenced him to death, and 6 days later he was transferred to San Quentin. In an interesting turn of events, Scott did die on death row, but it wasn't due to a scheduled execution. Scott died a couple of years ago in July of 2020 after contracting COVID-19. In our number 5 spot today, we have Charles Ng. Charles' story starts off shortly after he moved to the United States on a student visa. He dropped out after his first semester, and soon after he was involved in a hit-and-run accident. He then tried to avoid prosecution by enlisting in the United States Marine Corps, using false documents that stated his birthplace was within the United States. He was arrested by military police a year later for stealing automatic weapons, and then somehow he escaped custody, headed back toward Northern California, and this is where he met Leonard Lake, who is another real piece of work. Charles did end up going away and serving a bit of time, but it was only 18 months and he was back with Leonard, and that is when the two started their crime spree. It is believed that together the pair took the lives of somewhere from 11 to 25 different people. When Leonard was caught and brought in for questioning, he sneakily took a cyanide pill he had hidden in his jacket and took his own life, but Charles ended up standing trial. He was convicted for 11 of the killings, and he remains on death row at San Quentin. In our number 4 spot today, we have Sean Great. Sean is a serial killer who committed a series of crimes from 2006 until until he was apprehended in 2016. Throughout his decade of criminal activity, it is thought that he took the lives of at least 5 people. So basically, his story is a little confusing, but in September of 2016, Sean was arrested and later indicted for 2 killings as well as a kidnapping and harming a woman whose 911 call actually led to his arrest. At the same time, in another county next door, he was also being charged with 2 other deaths as well as another one from all the way back in 2016. This final count from all of those years ago was actually an unsolved Jane Doe case who had been unidentified for 12 years. When Sean confessed to this crime, he wasn't even sure who she was, he just said he believed her name was Dana. On May 7th, 2018, Sean was convicted on 2 of the counts, and on March 1st, 2019, he pleaded guilty to 2 of the others, and on September 11th, 2019, he pleaded guilty to the additional count. In the end, he was sentenced to death and has remained on death row since that final plea and sentencing, and he is currently scheduled to be executed in 2025. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Zodiac Killer. This one had to make it on this list because while there are a plethora of terrifying people on this list, nothing is as terrifying as an uncaught serial killer, and the Zodiac is definitely the most prolific of them all. The Zodiac Killer took the lives of 5 people in the San Francisco Bay Area between 1968 and October of 1969. He was most known for targeting young couples or a lone male cab driver. Despite 2 people luckily and thankfully escaping his attempted evil doings, he has still never been caught. While no one has heard from the Zodiac since 1974, the case remains active in many different counties, and maybe one day we'll finally know who the real Zodiac is. In our number 2 spot today, we have Dale Hausner and Samuel Dietman. Known as the serial shooters, the crimes these guys committed are definitely on the list of fears I have, which I'm pretty sure spawned from a Criminal Minds episode. These 2 were actively committing these crimes between May of 2005 and August of 2006. Basically, they were arsonists who would randomly set fire to objects, but they would also drive around and commit random drive-by shootings. That's the really scary part. The fire thing is also bad, don't get me wrong. There's just something about completely random violence that absolutely terrifies me. In the end, a series of tips is what led investigators to identify the perpetrators of these horrible crimes. In particular, one from a friend of Samuel who explained that Sam had actually confessed to some of the killings one night while drinking. In Dale's trial, he was found guilty of 80 out of the 87 felony charges that were brought forth, and that was all in one single trial. In the end, he was sentenced to death 6 times, and his brother, who was later found out to have assisted in some of the crimes, was sentenced to 25 years. Samuel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Doodler. While this nickname sounds very sweet, it, like everything else on this list, is very sinister. The nickname that this unidentified killer received is due to his practice of sketching his victims before taking their lives. This unidentified killer committed their crimes in the San Francisco area from January of 1974 to September of 1975, and they specifically targeted gay men. It is believed that 14 deaths can be attributed to this killer, while 3 others were injured in the process. Unfortunately, because of the stigma and sensitivity surrounding gay men at the time, the 3 who survived this monster were very reluctant when speaking with the authorities for fear of being outed as a result of it. This has led to there being very little information for them to work with in terms of identifying the man responsible. For a while, there was a primary suspect, but that person has never been officially charged because sadly, none of the survivors felt comfortable enough to testify in court. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the River City Ripper. One of the most terrifying things that exists are serial killers who are still on the loose, especially when you find out that they've been recently active. This serial killer is wanted in connection to 4 different incidents that occurred in Little Rock, Arkansas, 3 of which were fatal. These horrific crimes took place between August of 2020 and April of 2021, and despite one of the victims thankfully surviving the attack and being able to provide a description of the assailant, there's still very little to go on in terms of being able to identify this horrible human. The FBI was contacted shortly after their survivor was able to give a testimony to authorities, and their behavioral analysis team created a profile of this unidentified killer. These crimes are terrible any way you spin them, but one of the most terrifying parts is that they were all just random acts of violence that occurred completely unprovoked. The case has gained quite a bit of attention, but still, the monster remains at large. In our number 9 spot today, we have Tommy Lynn Sells. Before I get into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit that thumbs up if you're enjoying the video. It really does help us out. Tommy Lynn Sells was an American serial killer who is responsible for 22 confirmed deaths, but authorities have said that they know that there are more. I actually watched an interview that he did, and one of the aspects that scared me the most while watching him talk about his crimes is how you can tell that he committed these acts because he wanted to. and because he liked it. In the end, Tommy was caught because of someone who survived his attack in the most incredible way. She was able to go on and give such a good description of him that it led to his capture, and she was able to positively identify him. Not only did she save her own life, but who knows how many others. In the end, Tommy and his crimes were deemed so horrific that he received the death sentence. While in jail, he said that there wasn't one day that went by where he didn't think about, quote, the one that got away, which is absolutely chilling. Tommy's life came to an end when he was executed on April 3rd, 2014. In our number 8 spot today, we have Glenn Stewart Godwin. Man, this guy definitely has quite the history. So basically, in 1980, Glenn was working in California and didn't really have too much of a criminal record. For some reason, he and his roommate, however, decided to make a plan to rob someone that they knew who was once a friend of theirs. Of course, things go awry, and it turns into a botched robbery, and Glenn ends up taking the life of the person they were robbing. Also, this isn't necessarily important to what we're talking about today, but it's so unhinged I just can't leave it out. In an attempt to destroy evidence, Glenn tried to blow up the crime scene. The explosive went off, but obviously they were still able to figure out who committed the crime. Both Glenn and his roommate were both tried and convicted for the crimes in 1983. This, of course, is not where the story ends. In 1987, Glenn tried to escape prison and failed, and this landed him at a higher security prison, Folsom State Prison, which is maximum security. Somehow, once at this new prison, he attempted another escape, and this time was successful. He fled to Mexico, where he tried unsuccessfully to be a part of the illegal drug trade. He was arrested again and sentenced in Mexico, and this is when American authorities began the process of getting him extradited. During this process, Glenn decided that it would be a brilliant idea to take the life of an inmate who was a member of the Mexican drug cartel, which very obviously slowed the process of extradition. This gave him time to plan another escape, which he did in 1991, and since then, he's been on the run. No one knows where he is. How lovely. In our number 8 spot today, we have Richard Chase. This evil person is said to have taken the lives of 6 people within the span of a month between 1977 and 1978. That's a lot of people in a very short amount of time, which is absolutely terrifying. Before his crimes, Richard's life was already full of terrible stories and horrific acts that had him spending time in mental institutions before his crime spree. While at these facilities, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but after going through treatment and beginning medication, he was deemed to no longer be a threat to society and was released into his mother's care. Here's where things take a turn for the worse, however. Instead of helping take care of Richard, his mother instead weaned him off of his medication and got him all set up with his own apartment. Nice. Really helpful and cool of her. Initially, when he moved into the apartment, he had roommates, but eventually they all moved out and he was alone, which is when things really got wild. He began killing various animals, which he would then eat raw, sometimes mixing the organs with Coca-Cola in a blender and then drinking it. It's horrible. After this, he would unfortunately go on his killing spree, which had horrific details and would only end when he was startled by a visitor at the home of where his final crime took place. He fled the scene, but he was later caught and stood trial. Although there were many attempts to have him be spared of the death sentence, in the end, this didn't work. In December of 1980, Richard was found passed away in his jail cell after taking too many of his prescribed medication. In our number 7 spot today, we have Rodney Alcala. Rodney is a horrible monster who was convicted and sentenced to death for 5 killings that he committed in California from 1977 to 1979. He also received an additional 25 years to life after pleading guilty to 2 other killings in New York in 1971 and 1977. Rodney got away with his crimes for a while because he wasn't the top of the list of suspects because he was said to be the, quote, charming photographer. Rodney is often referred to as the dating game killer because of his appearance on the show, which, with what we now know about him, is absolutely horrifying. What's crazy is that he actually won the show he was on, but the episode's bachelorette refused to go on a date with him because she found him creepy. This is just a reminder to always trust your instincts. It isn't exactly known just how many victims Rodney had. It is potentially thought that it could be much higher than the number he was convicted for. In July of last year, Rodney passed away in prison at the age of 77. In our number 7 spot today, we have Arthur Shawcross. This man is also known as the Genesee River Killer, and his crime spree began in 1972. In trying to navigate these online guidelines, I can't exactly say who he specifically targeted, but what I will say is that while everyone on this list is particularly horrible, Arthur's were some of the worst of the worst. if you catch my drift. This story, however, is a little unlike some of the others today because after the first two of his crimes, he was apprehended, but for some insane reason, they allowed him to have a plea bargain where he was allowed to plead guilty to just one charge of only manslaughter, for which he served 14 years of his 25-year sentence. In the least surprising turn of events, once he was released on early probation, his real crime spree got started. He would go on to take the lives of 12 women from 1988 and 1989. Thankfully, he was finally caught for these crimes and sent right back to prison. Of course, his initial early release was the subject of huge controversy, rightfully, and Dr. Michael H. Stone, professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, called this early release, quote, one of the most egregious examples of the unwarranted release of a prisoner. In the end, Arthur passed away in prison while serving a 250-year sentence. He passed in 2008 after suffering a heart attack. In our number 6 spot today, we have Richard Ramirez. Richard, who is also known as the Night Stalker, was a serial killer who terrorized the streets of Los Angeles in the 1980s. He was known for his MO of invading homes, which left him initially being dubbed as the walk-in killer, but he had another signature that was concerning to many people, especially during the height of the Satanic Panic. Richard was known for leaving behind different satanic messages at the scene of his crimes. Because of his satanic signature, after he left his first pentagram at the scene of the crime, authorities became worried that he was a Charles Manson copycat, but instead he was just his own kind of monster. It is said that he would leave more pentagrams behind while also telling his victims to swear to Satan instead of God. During his court appearances, he would hold up a pentagram, and after pleading not guilty, he said, "Hail Satan." In our number 5 spot today, we have the Colonial Parkway Monster. Between 1986 and 1989, there were 3 couples who were found in their cars after their lives had been taken, and all of these couples were found along Virginia's Colonial Parkway. Although this is a horrific thing that investigators believed to be linked, all these years later, whoever is responsible for these crimes remains somewhere at large. There are plenty of theories as to who could have done this, just like with any cold case of this kind, but terrifyingly, many people believe that the culprit may have been someone impersonating a police officer. This is because each of the victims were found with their glove compartments open, which some believe indicates that they were reaching for their registration, and this might be the reason as to why they even pulled over in the first place. This is just a theory, however, and true or not, at this point it isn't bringing us any closer to finding out who is really responsible for these horrific crimes. In our number 4 spot today, we have Michael Bear Carson and Susan Carson. This couple is not one that anyone would want to encounter. The stories of these two come from the 80s. They were married, and on the outside they appeared just like a couple of harmless hippies. We all know not to judge a book by its cover though. In the end, they would go on to become known as the San Francisco Witch Killers. Yeah, not just a thing for Salem in the 1600s, unfortunately. Basically, together the pair took the lives of 3 separate people between 1981 and 1983. They started off by killing their roommate, who Susan claimed was a witch, and said that she was stealing her quote health, power, and beauty. Sounds like someone was a little jealous to me. They next killed one guy that they worked on a farm with because they said that he was a demon. The final person they took the life of unfortunately picked up the pair as they were hitchhiking, and they took his life because they claimed that he was a quote black witch, whatever that means. Essentially, they were just committing crimes against people that they claimed to be witches. The pair were each tried and convicted for each separate crime and are both serving sentences of 75 years to life. Neither of them have shown any kind of remorse for what they've done. In our number 3 spot today, we have Kenneth Bianchi. The Hillside Strangler, which was later found out to be a pair of cousins working together, were Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. The two were charged and convicted for harming and taking the lives of 10 separate women together, with Kenneth taking the lives of 2 others on his own. After an extremely intensive investigation and the arrest of the two, Kenneth began to try and set up an insanity defense. He claimed dissociative identity disorder. He blamed his alter ego Steve for the horrific multitude of crimes. Luckily, however, a court psychologist, Dr. Martin Orn, observed him and his behavior and found that his claims were untrue. After being presented with this finding, Kenneth agreed to plead guilty and testify against his cousin in exchange for leniency on his sentence. He ended up being sentenced to life in prison, with his cousin getting sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. While Angelo had a heart attack and passed in 2002, Kenneth still remains in prison. In our number 2 spot today, we have Vicki Dawn Dawn Jackson. Vicky was a woman who worked as a nurse for a number of years. She first got her nursing license in 1989, but it wasn't until the 2000s when things took a very dark turn. Between December of 2000 and February of 2001, the hospital that Vicky was working for recorded a number of deaths that was unusual. It was a higher amount. Most of these patients were in the age range of 60 to 100 years old, so of course people just chalked this up to the advanced age of most of these patients, but a rumor began to spread that someone just might be responsible. After this, the hospital's administrator noticed that a vial of called Mivacron had gone missing. You might see where I'm going with this. As it turns out, the person responsible was Nurse Vicky, and she had at least 10 patients whose lives she took by giving them too much of this missing drug. It was a muscle relaxant. Take in that this is 10 people between December and February. That is an unbelievable amount of people in a remarkably short amount of time. You might be wondering why she took these lives, and apparently she did it when she found those people rude or, quote, too demanding. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Axemen of New Orleans. Unfortunately, this is not the name of some terrible horror flick, and instead it is the moniker given to a terrible, unidentified serial killer. This person was active in New Orleans, Louisiana, and its surrounding areas from May of 1918 to October 1919. As the name implies, those who were targeted by this person were usually attacked with an axe, and it was usually one that actually belonged to the victims themselves. Many people believe that this person may have been targeting people of Italian descent because this was the theme among the victims, and some also believe that he was mainly targeting women and only took the lives of men when they tried to intervene. This is actually somewhat supported by the homes where women were killed but the men weren't. In the end, although this person is responsible for taking at least 12 lives, exactly who the Axeman is or was remains a mystery. In our number 7 spot today, we have Rose West. Rose West is an English serial killer who committed her crimes alongside her husband. He definitely also would make a spot on this list, but he decided to take his own life in 1995 after being arrested while awaiting trial. The terrible pair were investigated and subsequently arrested for taking 9 lives together, with Rose receiving an additional charge for another 10th life. During the court proceedings, against the advice of her counsel, Rose decided that she would testify herself, and what a trip that was. During her testimony, she sometimes was very tearful and very dramatic, but of course, an act like that can be hard to keep up, so other times she was just cracking jokes and laughing. Imagine doing your tight 5 while you're on trial for the worst of the worst crimes. Luckily, it seems as though the jury hated that as much as I do, because they all came back with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all 10 crimes. In prison, Rose West met Myra Hindley, which if you don't know who that is, she committed a bunch of very similar crimes with her partner as well, and the two became besties and even had an affair in jail. But throughout the whole thing, Rose is still trying to say that she was totally innocent and that Fred was completely responsible for all of the crimes. So wild. In our number 6 spot today, we have Chester Turner. Chester is an American serial killer who, on April 30th, 2007, was convicted of taking the lives of 11 women in the Los Angeles area, and on June 19th, 2014, he was convicted of 4 more that they were able to tie back to him. He has been referred to by prosecutors as one of the most prolific serial killers in the city's history, and if you know Los Angeles' history with things like that, that is not something to take lightly. Due to other crimes that Chester had committed where he was caught, he had to submit a DNA sample. This sample is what ended up leading authorities to solving these horrific crimes that he had committed. At the time, these cases were turning cold, but thankfully Chester being caught for other crimes is what allowed them to have a break in the case. In his original trial that led to conviction, Chester was sentenced to death, but at the following one in 2014, he also received an additional death sentence. In our number 5 spot today, we have Gary Ridgway. This horrible human being is also sometimes known as the Green River Killer, and his crimes took place somewhere between 1982 to potentially as recent as 2001. He was convicted for 49 crimes, but confessed to an unbelievable 71, which makes him the second most prolific serial killer in the United States in terms of confirmed killings. Most of his victims were either sex workers or women in other vulnerable circumstances, and through DNA profiling evidence in 2001, authorities were able to connect him to 4 of his crimes. From there, they made a deal with him where they would spare him the death sentence in exchange for the disclosure of the locations of all of the missing women. Gary took the deal and was spared a death sentence, and instead was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He remains in prison and is currently 73 years old. In our number 4 spot today, we have the West Mesa Bone Collector. This is the name used to describe an unidentified serial killer who is said to be responsible for taking the lives of 11 different pregnant women whose remains were found buried in the desert of West Mesa in 2009. It is thought that this could be one person, or it could potentially be linked to some sort of a group. There have been tips throughout the years, and authorities have worked hard to try and get to the bottom of these crimes, but still the killer remains at large. There have been a few different suspects throughout the years, but there hasn't been enough concrete evidence to charge anyone with the crimes yet. What's interesting about this case is that although the remains were found in 2009, according to authorities, upon examining satellite images, it is believed that the last of the remains were placed there in 2005. In our number 3 spot today, we have Hebert Mullen. It is said that Hebert, before his crime spree, was quite bright and well liked. He was voted most likely to succeed in high school, but by his mid-30s his life had taken a dark turn, and he was now a serial killer who would go on to take the lives of at least 13 people. To be perfectly honest, Hebert definitely had some mental illness struggles that greatly contributed to the horrific crimes that he committed. That does not excuse what he has done, but it would be completely unfair not to mention that part of the story. Experts have explained that Hebert suffers from paranoid schizophrenia, and he believed that his crimes were preventing earthquakes in California. He only believed this sort of fantasy more after his arrest because, coincidentally, there were no earthquakes in California during his crime spree, but there was one shortly after his arrest. In 1973, he was sentenced to life in prison, and although he has been up for parole a number of times, he has been denied every time, with the next hearing taking place in 2025. In our number 2 spot today, we have Jeffrey Dahmer. This is one man who was exceptionally terrifying because of his actions, but he was also very smart, which adds an extra layer of terror to this one. Dahmer, who became known as the Milwaukee Monster, is one of the most prolific serial killers ever, and considering everyone we've talked about today, we know that's not an easy title to get. He became fixated with animals at a young age, and if you're interested in true crime and criminology, you know what happens next and how bad of a sign it is. Dahmer dropped out of business school due to alcohol abuse after just 3 months and enlisted in the US Army to train as a medical specialist, but that didn't last long as he was discharged after he attacked 2 fellow soldiers. After this, Dahmer fell hard into alcoholism, and this is when he went on his killing spree. Just to be clear, those 2 things are not related. I know you know that, but I don't want anyone to think otherwise. Between 1971 and 1999, Dahmer went on to take the lives of 17 people, and some of the things that came after included the permanent preservation of the body parts, typically all or part of the skeleton. So, yeah. Things were very dark. One of his victims was able to escape and booked it to the police, which is of course what led to Dahmer being caught for his atrocious crimes. When they got there, the chief medical examiner remarked that it was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. In the end, Dahmer was tried and convicted and sentenced to 15 life imprisonments, and in February of 1992 he received an additional life sentence for a crime he hadn't yet been tried for that occurred in Ohio. In our number 1 spot today, we have Christopher Scarver. On June 1st, 1990, Christopher showed up at the Wisconsin Conservation Corps Training Program office, and there he demanded money from the man he found. When the man only gave him $15, Christopher went on to shoot him. Christopher then went and demanded money from another man and continued to shoot the man that he had already shot until this second man gave him more money. Christopher was caught and convicted for this atrocious crime, but his story does not end here. On November 28, 1994, Christopher was assigned work detail with 2 other inmates. One was Jesse Anderson, who had taken the life of his own wife, and the other was none other than the man we just talked about, prolific serial killer and monster, Jeffrey Dahmer. Well, when the 3 were left alone, Christopher took a bar from a piece of equipment in the exercise room, and he used that to basically beat and then kill the other 2. Not gonna lie, there is no excuse and no reason for any of the crimes that these people committed, including these ones, but there is a very weird sort of poetic justice to that. Christopher was tried again for these 2 crimes and received 2 more life sentences. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the alphabet. There are a lot of scary people on this list today, but some of the scariest people out there are the ones we know have committed horrific crimes, but have yet to be identified. Yes, we are talking cold cases, unsolved crimes right now, and we are talking one of the worst. The alphabet killings are a series of unsolved crimes named because of how each victim had their first initial that matched their last. So like their first name and their last name started with the same letter. They know the crimes are linked, or at least have reason to suspect they are, because of a similar MO that includes how the life was taken and where the remains were placed afterwards. They were all taken in a similar area around a similar time. There are theories and suspects as to who could have committed these horrific crimes, crimes, but as of right now, no one knows for sure. These crimes were committed between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York, and because of the timing, it's possible that whoever committed these crimes could still be alive, but perhaps they're not. Authorities, despite having an immensely difficult job placed in front of them, are still committed and trying to solve this case. In our number 9 spot today, we have John Wayne Gacy. With a nickname like Killer Clown, it is abundantly clear why everyone would want to stay away from this actual monster. He got his start in this horrifying nickname by being a clown for children's birthday parties, charitable events, and that sort of thing. According to Gacy himself, all of his crimes were committed inside of his ranch house, where he would lure his victims into. He would then trick them into wearing handcuffs under the pretense that he was going to show some sort of a magic trick, and from here the horror unfortunately ensued. It is thought that he took the lives of somewhere around 33 young men, most of which he buried in a crawl space in his home. On the evening of December 11th, 1978, Gacy took the life of his last victim, Robert Peist. Gacy lured the young man in when he went into the pharmacy that he worked at, and while talking with the store owner, loudly declared so that Robert could hear that he often hired teenagers for his firm at a starting rate of $5 per hour, which was double what Robert was getting at the pharmacy. In hopes of getting a new good job, Robert ended up inquiring further after his shift at the pharmacy was over. When Robert's mother filed a missing persons report, the pharmacy owner was able to explain that Gacy was likely the person he went to speak to about a job, and when the police looked into Gacy's background, all the pieces were there just waiting to be put together. Subsequent investigation, questioning, and searches led police to gather all of the evidence they needed to arrest and charge him, and his conviction for 33 killings was, at the time, the most by one individual in the United States legal history. He was sentenced to death on March 13th, 1980, and on May 10th, 1994, he was executed by lethal injection, and I'm not gonna lie, I think that's something we can all be grateful for. In our number 8 spot today, we have Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine was a New Orleans socialite who was an evil person behind closed doors. It is said that in public, Delphine was polite and appeared as if she cared for those who were enslaved in her home, which is the most ridiculous sentence I've ever said, but that's what the accounts of people who lived in this time said. Delphine's social standing remained until, on April 10th, 1834, authorities responded to a fire at her Royal Street mansion. When they arrived and went inside, no one was prepared for the horrors they were about to see, as they discovered bound slaves in her attic who had clear signs of violent behavior over a very long period of time. Following this, her house was swarmed by an outraged group of New Orleans citizens, but somehow Delphine was able to escape with her family to France. While the angry group destroyed her entire home, Delphine never faced any punishments for her crimes, which is one of the most frustrating endings to this horrible, awful story. In our number 7 spot today, we have Lester Eubanks. If you're a fan of unsolved mysteries, you might be familiar with this story. Lester is a man who is convicted and sentenced to prison in 1966 for taking someone's life. In December of 1973, Lester was a part of an honor assignment that gave him the opportunity to be at the mall to do some Christmas shopping. While at the mall, he ended up escaping custody and has been on the run ever since. Through investigations into his family and friends, police were led to a center for troubled youth where he was said to have been working, but Lester was nowhere to be found. The most recent development in this case came in 2019 when Lester's biological son agreed to give a DNA sample which could be used to link Lester to recent crimes and maybe give an idea on where he could be hiding, but FBI policies that you cannot search using a family member's DNA. It's crazy that someone could be on the run for so long without anyone recognizing or finding them, and it makes me really wonder if anyone in his new life knows about his dark past. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Honolulu Killer. This is another one of those pesky, horrifying, unidentified serial who of course was active in and around Honolulu, Hawaii. These crimes took place in 1985 and 1986, and throughout those years it is said that whoever is responsible for these crimes took the lives of at least 5 women. The women seemingly didn't have any connection to each other as they were all from different walks of life, but because of the gruesome similarities of each crime, authorities were able to determine that they were likely committed by the same person. Despite the years it's been, the perpetrator has never been identified and could still be out there somewhere. hiding from taking responsibility for their actions. In our number 5 spot today, we have Daniel Perez. Daniel Perez might be better known by his alias Lou Castro, but he truthfully is just best not being known at all because he sucks. Daniel led a cult that was located on a 20-acre property in a rural area just north of Wichita. He convinced his followers that he had magical powers, and he told them all that he was a centuries-old angel who needed to commit some horrific crimes in order to stay alive. Weird story. These crimes would have certainly been more than enough to throw him on this list, but he of course just couldn't stop at committing one type of crime. He had to make sure he just really stole the show on being the worst. Basically, he had this clever idea to use his followers' life insurance policies to live a lavish lifestyle, like as if no one would think that's weird or suspicious. While some of these life insurance policies were collected through regular means, of course that kind of greed only leads to evil things, which of course means that he ended up taking one of his followers' lives so he could collect the cash. It is thought that he also contributed to the deaths of some of the other people's life insurance policies he cashed in on, but unfortunately there was never any evidence that would be able to substantiate that claim. Despite this, however, on April 21st, 2010, authorities were able to arrest Daniel and he was charged with 28 felonies. In February of 2015, he was convicted on all counts and received a sentence of 80 years in jail. In our number 4 spot today, we have the I-70. This is the name of what is believed to be an unidentified serial who is known to have taken the lives of 6 store clerks in the Midwest in the spring of 1992. The reason he is referred to as the I-70 killer is because most of the stores were just a few miles off of Interstate 70. While most of his victims were women, there was one man, but it is believed that he may have been expecting a female employee. The killings were clearly the main objective of his crimes as well, considering the fact that at each scene there was only a small amount of cash that was taken. Aside from these initial 6 crimes, it is thought that he also might be responsible for the deaths of 3 more store clerks in Texas in 1993 and 1994, as well as 1 more in Indiana in 2001. This story has been featured on episodes of Unsolved Mysteries, America's Most Wanted, and Dark Minds, but despite this, whoever is responsible has never been identified. In our number 3 spot today, we have Ted Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski is most often referred to as the Unabomber due to the atrocious crimes that he committed. He was known as being quite bright from a young age, and it is believed that he had an IQ of about 167. He was accepted into Harvard at the age of just 16, and he went on to receive a PhD. At 25, things were still looking bright for the guy as he had landed himself a job as an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley, but 2 years later he resigned from that position and his life took quite a drastic and dark turn. In 1971, it is said that Ted moved to a remote cabin in Montana that had no electricity or running water. From 1971 until 1977, Ted learned to live a hermit, off-the-grid style life while learning different survival skills, but once 1978 rolled around, he was ready to start his terror campaign. From here until 1995, he began a nationwide against people who were involved with modern technology. He planted these weapons or would mail them, and in the end took the lives of 3 people and severely injured 23. Just like many of these kinds of people, his own ego and delusions got in the way because on April 24th, 1995, he sent an anonymous handwritten letter that was addressed to the police via the New York Times. His own brother ended up recognizing his handwriting, however, and that's the tip that he gave to the FBI. Ted was captured, tried, and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. In our number 2 spot today, we have Dorothea Puente. You know the saying, don't judge a book by its cover? Well, this is certainly a case of that. If you took one glance at Dorothea and knew nothing about her, you'd probably assume she was someone's kind grandma who also had some cookies and a glass of milk waiting around, but that could not be any further from the actual truth. She was actually a serial killer, and she decided to prey upon some of the most vulnerable people in our communities, people who were seeking help and assistance. Dorothea operated a large rooming house that was set in a large Victorian home in Sacramento, California. The residents who would often stay there were people who struggled with different substances such as alcohol, people who had been in mental hospitals, and the elderly. All of these people were receiving social security checks, and if they suddenly vanished, she figured no one would ask. In 1982, they did begin to vanish, but of course, their social security checks were continually being cashed. Of course, as it turns out, Dorothea was taking their lives and then their money. She has now been called the landlady from hell. In our number 1 spot today we have Albert Fish. Albert is one of the oldest people on this list, but that does not mean his crimes were any less horrific than anyone else's. Dubbed the Brooklyn Vampire or the Moon Maniac or even the Boogeyman himself, it is clear that Albert was a terrible human being who did terrible things. In the early 1900s, Albert was arrested, tried, and convicted for killing and eating 3 people, but the horror was not over here. No, Albert began to claim that although people knew about 3, the number was actually closer to 100, and he even claimed that he had some in every state. That's disgusting. To make matters even worse, as if this wasn't already terrible enough, this deranged lunatic also sent a letter to the mother of one of his victims. He detailed everything about how he lured her and the rest of the horrific things that occurred afterwards, like how he proceeded to eat her over the course of 9 days. Yeah, this is another person that I'm not sad at all that they don't exist anymore. It's perfectly fine by me. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Keith Hunter Jesperson. Also known as the Happy Face Killer, Keith was so desperate for attention for his crimes, it might have led to his own demise. Keith is a killer who, after the body of his first victim was found, had someone else actually claim to be responsible for his crimes. When you're trying to get away with killing people, having someone else falsely confess to your crime would likely seem like the best case scenario, right? Well, not for Keith. He wanted to be known for his crimes, so to help himself get media attention, he drew a smiley face on a bathroom wall hundreds of miles away from his crime scene, and here he left an anonymous letter where he confessed to the crime and provided proof. He didn't end up receiving a reply, so he decided to write more letters to the media and to authorities, each signed with a smiley face. In the end, Keith was initially caught after he became the prime suspect in the death of his girlfriend at the time. Previously, his victims had been people he had no connection to, so this truly was the mistake the authorities needed to catch him. Keith then admitted to his crimes, and while he has formally been linked to 8 deaths, he has confessed to somewhere around 185. Keith was tried and sentenced to life without parole for his heinous crimes, and he remains in prison at Oregon State Penitentiary. In our number 9 spot today we have Franklin Dwayne Alex. Franklin is a man who had quite an insane crime spree that lasted for about 6 months in the 1990s. Although short, it was anything but sweet. The spree started off in August of 1997 in Houston, Texas. Over the course of this spree, Franklin took the lives of at least 3 people. He committed robberies, he harmed people, he attempted to take more lives where thankfully the people survived, he kidnapped people, literally any serious crime he could commit during those 6 months he was doing it. In the end, Franklin was caught and put on trial for his crime spree, and he received a sentence of death which was carried out on March 30th, 2010. In our number 8 spot today we have David Parker Ray. Often referred to as the Toy Box Killer, this guy is anything but fun. This serial killer nickname comes from how he soundproofed a semi-trailer, which he called his toy box, and he equipped it full of everything a nightmare human being would need to commit his horrific crimes. Here's the thing, although he was highly suspected of taking lives, there was never enough evidence to prove it because the bodies were never found. This means that although many people are quite sure that he did such things, he was never officially tried for it. He was, however, tried and convicted for kidnapping as well as for harming those he had taken. He would sometimes include his wife in these instances, she was a willing participant, and then many of those he took he would later drop off on the side of the road somewhere after using barbiturates in an attempt to destroy their memories that could potentially identify him. Whether he took any lives or not is still up for debate, I suppose, but that does not mean he is any better than anyone else on this list. He is equally as horrible of a person. In the end, David was convicted for his crimes, which is thought to be up in the range of about 60 instances in 2001, and then he died of a heart attack in 2002 in prison. In our number 9 spot today we have the Long Island serial killer. Also known as the Craigslist Ripper, the LISK is an unidentified suspect who is believed to have taken the lives of 10 to 16 people over the last 20 years. The victims so far that are known have been sex workers who used Craigslist to advertise their work. After the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert, police were searching an area along the Ocean Parkway, and that is when they began to discover the remains of the victims. The first 4 were found in December of 2010, with another 6 being found in March and April of 2011. As of December 2015, the FBI is now officially involved in the investigation. There has been a suspect in this case, but any formal charges have not been laid in terms of these crimes. The most recent evidence in regards to these cases was a belt found at the scene of the crime, which may potentially belong to the killer. At this same time, it was was announced that new scientific evidence was being used in the investigation, but these announcements came just last year, so we have yet to receive any further updates. Hopefully this case is solved quickly so that the families of the victims can receive justice and this terrible person is off the streets for good.
Coming in at number 1, we have the atom bomb. If the name Robert Oppenheimer doesn't ring any bells, maybe this will. Coming in at number 1, we have the atomic bomb. See, there it is. Robert Oppenheimer invented the atomic bomb, and the first one that successfully detonated created a mushroom cloud 40,000 feet high. What people did with this new invention, however, stole an unfathomable amount of lives and opened doors for even more deadly weapons. It also led to one of the most terrifying standoffs in history during the 1960s called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The USA and Soviet Russia were caught in a standoff, both with nukes pointing at each other, waiting for the other to press the big red button. Thankfully, neither did, but many countries have nukes in their arsenal ready to strike whenever they want, and they're also still used in a lot of battles and war today. Considering how much damage was done to Nagasaki and Hiroshima due to the detonations of Fat Man and Little Boy in 1945, oh man, I hope that day never comes, and they just should get rid of them. Like, no country should just have them, because we definitely know that it will lead to the destruction of the world if they're ever used. We just should make an agreement that get rid, we forget, destroy all the ways of making them, just let's get rid. Albert Einstein was the man who prompted the USA to invent the atom bomb in order to combat the Germans in World War II. He believed the Germans were working on the bomb as well, but he found out too late that that wasn't the case, and they weren't even as far as he thought they were. He immediately regretted his decision, which is why the atomic bomb makes our list of inventions we should all forget. Just get rid of it. He's not the only one who wished it never existed. He's not the only one who wished it never existed. We should just get rid of it. Like, what it...
In our 9th spot, we have the mousetrap pistol. And if you guys are liking this video so far, then make sure to give it a big thumbs up. You guys already know the drill. So this was an invention that seemed like a good idea at the time, but in the end, it was found faulty for a number of reasons. So in 1882, a man named James A. Williams from Texas decided to create a trap, and I quote, by which animals which burrow in the ground can be destroyed. He then took inspiration by burglar alarms from the 19th century, which was basically a pistol rigged on a contraption that would go off when someone opened a window or door. He thought that if it worked for humans, it would work for rodents too. So basically, his invention consisted of a revolver or pistol attached to basically a mousetrap. When the mouse set it off, the weapon would go off. So you see how problematic that would be? It would kill the mouse, but also take out chunks of your floor. And imagine if your foot accidentally triggered that trap. Ouch. So you can see why this invention never really took off. In our 8th spot, we have the blood-powered lamp. Okay, the award for the strangest invention goes to this one. The blood-powered lamp is exactly what it sounds like. It's a lamp that was powered by your blood. It was also called the Dracula bulb. It was created by a man named Mike Thompson from the Netherlands, and he designed and created it not too long ago, just in 2007. You know, a time where we have electricity. So I don't know why he thought this was a good invention, but it is kind of cool, so I'll give him that. Anyways, basically, the lamp contains luminol, which is what forensic scientists use to see if there's any blood at crime scenes. Luminol reacts with the iron in blood, and as a result, it creates this bright blue glow. So this guy thought it would be a good idea to make a lamp out of luminol. Only thing is that you need to cut yourself every time that you want to use it. Basically, to use the lamp, first you mix an activating powder, then you break the ball. You cut yourself, and then you add your blood in it. As a result, the lamp will start to glow. Like I said, it's kind of cool, but also kind of really unnecessary. Coming in at number 7, we have the Pear of Anguish. This was another disgusting medieval torture device. So the Pear of Anguish, sometimes called the choke pear, was this pear-shaped metal device that you never want to be subjected to. So basically, this device was inserted into a victim's downstairs area or their mouth. Then they could turn the screw attached to this device and the pear pieces would bloom, basically expanding, and it would stretch your openings. It was often used to get information or a confession out of someone. Basically, the device will get so uncomfortable that you'll either cave in or it'll rip your skin apart. What's sick is that they didn't want to use this device to kill someone. No, they wanted it to just stretch them apart slowly to cause immense pain that lasts for hours or even days. In our 6th spot, we have the Scold's Brittle. This terrifying looking mask thing is referred to as the Scold's Brittle. The first recorded use of this device was back in 1564 Scotland. Shortly after, England started using them as well. Basically, this mask was a form of public humiliation and torture. Basically, women were forced to wear this as a form of punishment for behaving immodest or rude, or if they were accused of infidelity or witchcraft. So this mask would be locked on over their head, so they couldn't remove it. Then there was a spike mouthpiece attached to it, so they weren't allowed to speak. They then had to walk around in public wearing it. It was meant to inflict pain on the person while simultaneously causing public humiliation. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the Iron Maiden, and I'm not talking about the band here. Chances are you have heard of this disturbing invention. Basically, it was a coffin-like device that was lined with spikes. The victim was then placed in the coffin, and then the executioner would close the door. The spikes were then shot directly into the victim's body. But here's the thing. They specifically positioned the spike so that the victim wouldn't die immediately. Instead, it would be a slow and painful death where they just slowly bled out. That is terrifying. Also, who was responsible for cleaning that device? Because that would suck. Coming in at number 4, we have the spike collar. So picture the Iron Maiden, and now picture it around your neck. That's basically what the spike collars were. A collar with spikes all on the inside. It was then placed on a victim and the spikes would dig into their necks. What's worse than the discomfort is the fact that they wouldn't be able to lay down or sleep. They also couldn't eat or drink, so they would just suffer with this thing on for days on end. For prisoners, after the collar was placed on their neck, it was then fastened with ropes to the 4 walls in the room. The prisoner would stand in the middle. If they moved even an inch in one direction, the spikes would impale them, so they would have to stand incredibly still. In our 3rd spot, we have the rack. Although this invention doesn't have a scary name, don't be deceived. It is very gruesome. This was a popular torture device from medieval Europe. Basically, the victim would have their ankles and wrists tied to this device so that they were spread open. Then 2 executioners would crank the gears and the machine would slowly pull their limbs in the opposite directions, stretching them farther and farther apart until eventually they were ripped right off. I'm telling you, people back in the day were sick. Seriously, imagine if we use this now for criminals. That would never fly. Moving on at number 2, we have the dimple machine. Everyone is born with unique features. Maybe you have a butt chin, or unique birthmarks, or dimples. Now, if you don't have dimples, don't worry. There's a device that will give you some. Back in 1936, a woman named Isabella Gilbert created a device that will give people dimples. You know, if you weren't born with them and you were jealous. So basically how this works is the dimpleless person would place this contraption over their face. The device had 2 sets of knobs on either side of it that would poke into your skin. It was believed that if you were to wear this long enough, then it would train your cheeks to create dimples on their own. I'm sorry, no, that looks terrifying and also painful. And at our number 1 spot, we have the electric smile. Back in 2011 in Japan, a very weird invention was made to help children smile. It's crazy. So basically, it forces kids to smile by sending electric shocks to the kids' cheeks. This causes the face muscles to contract and voila, you got a smile. This is wrong on so many levels, but it was targeted towards parents as a method to snap their kids out of a tantrum or to make sure they are looking perfect out in public. Here's the creepy part. The shock is so strong that the smile can last for days. And a side effect is that it can cause some twitching. Like I said before, this invention is just so wrong on so many levels. I can't believe it's a real thing.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Angel Resendez. Also known as the Railroad Killer, Angel is said to have committed somewhere around 23 horrific crimes during his spree in both the United States and Mexico in the 1990s. He went on to become known as the Railroad Killer because of the fact that most of his crimes were committed near railroads, where he had just jumped off of trains he was using to travel around the country. Most of his crimes took place in the homes of those he harmed, and usually after the crimes he'd linger around to eat their food and sometimes steal their sentimental items. Sometimes he'd even take jewelry to re-gift to his mother and sister. In June of 1999, he was listed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, and when his sister saw him there, she was worried he would continue harming people, so she thankfully contacted the authorities. After this, they were able to convince him to surrender and he was sent to trial. In the end, he was sentenced to death by the jury, and although there were multiple appeal attempts, his death warrant was signed, and on June 27th, 2006, he received his sentence.
Coming in at number 9, the Fliz. You know that one of the safest parts about riding a bike is the fact that you can get into any sort of accident and you're not attached to it. You can kind of just fly off and jump off before you land in a mud puddle or scrape your knee or whatever. Another great part of a bike is that it has pedals and gears, so you can move much faster than if you were running or walking, which is kind of the idea. Even if you're out of shape and you haven't done a lot of cardio, like the people who get up at 4 a.m. and go for runs, oh my god, those people are like on another tier, they're like gods. Then you can definitely go really fast on a bike if you want to. And what on earth is a Fliz? This thing is what happens when you mix a jolly jumper with a bike and are willing to look embarrassing for everyone to see. The Fliz is a bike with no pedals, so you have to push with your feet like a Flintstone. And now this obviously sucks because you wouldn't really be able to move very fast at all. They also built a harness into it so you can hang in there like you're some sort of baby Bjorn. Usually when you invent a new thing, the goal is to try and make it better than the last version of said thing instead of making it worse or really stupid. So I don't think the guy who strolls in on the Fliz is going to have a swarm of men or women around them being like, oh my god, marry me, I love you, because they look so sexy. They'll probably be looking at him being like, what? Is he okay? And how do you go uphill with this thing? You have to just run up the hill as you're attached to a bike? What is the point of being the bike then?
In our 8th spot, we have bat bombs. Yeah, not bath bombs, bat bombs. This next one is not only terrifying, but also deadly. When it comes to warfare, people can get pretty inventive. Imagine you're stalking past enemy lines in the dead of night, when all of a sudden, a web-winged furry creature swoops in and drops a bomb right at your feet. Bat bombs were an experimental weapon developed in World War II, and they are exactly as they sound. It was a bat with a bomb attached to it. This would detonate on or near enemies. The plan was developed and submitted by Lytle S. Adams, a dentist from Irwin, Pennsylvania. He presented his idea to the White House just 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and they liked it and the project was greenlit. The doc assembled an oddball team, including a pilot turned actor, an ex-gangster, and an ex-hotel manager. The project was disbanded in 1943 because it was surpassed by a deadlier project. Stay tuned for that one later on in the list.
Coming in at number 7, we have the Urban Baby Window Cage. I can definitely see how this is appealing. Like, you want to make sure your baby gets a lot of fresh air, but you don't have time to take them for a walk when they're young. The Urban Window Baby Cage was basically a chain link cage with a pillow inside of it, so you could just plop your baby inside and go, look, a bird, Jimmy. Apparently everyone back then would have been totally fine with Michael Jackson dangling his baby outside his window because that's what they all did, apparently. The purpose of this contraption was so that your baby could get a little fresh air, because you don't want your baby to get all stuffy in your New York apartment that's the size of a shoebox. And this was in a time when elevators were both scarce and the chance of them killing you was much higher. Think Tower of Terror, but real life. So walking that potentially very chubby baby up and down 30 flights of stairs doesn't seem very fun as just hanging him outside a window so you can feel the sun in his face and hear all the slurs that New York construction workers offer to the patrons on the sidewalks. If your kid ever gets out of line, you can just throw them in the cage for a timeout. You know? That's, this is why we should forget this. It's not a good idea, guys. Let's just stick with, like, jolly jumpers and cribs that are inside. That sounds like a better idea.
In our 6th spot, we have the hydrogen blimps. Hydrogen blimps are labeled as one of the worst inventions of all time. Basically, it was like a big balloon in the sky. It would be pushed by propellers, and guess what they would put into the balloon to make it float? Hydrogen. Hydrogen was cheaper and more readily available, so they used it. Just there's one tiny issue with that. It was highly flammable. But they would pile people into this blimp that was fueled by hydrogen. And sadly, they would explode. In 1937, the Hindenburg, a German airship, caught fire and crashed in 36 seconds. It was very sad and very disastrous. But that wasn't even the first time that one exploded. Just after the Hindenburg, that's when people were like, "Okay, maybe this isn't safe." Now, history should never be forgotten. But maybe let's just never bring back hydrogen blimps, okay?
Coming in at number 5, we have plastic. I acknowledge that plastic has helped us get this far. It has been an important part of our development as a species. But just like when a young adult who has to shed their trauma that made them funny, but keep the funny, it's time for us to move on from the thing that is choking our planet. Like if you go outside right now and get a box of tea, the tea will come in a box that is wrapped in plastic. The box is already a container for the tea. Why are we double wrapping it, you know? I know the purpose is to increase the shelf life, but maybe we shouldn't be keeping things on shelves that long. Maybe? I don't know. We should seek out healthier food that doesn't last as long because it doesn't have as many preservatives. Thus, it would be stupid to wrap it in plastic. Just wrap it in paper or pour it into my hands. I don't know. Just do it. Or have no packaging and everyone just goes to bulk barns and puts it in glass jars and everything like that. I think that's a pretty good idea, but you know, who knows? The plastic, it lasts a little too long. Let's just say that.
In our 4th spot, we have the brazen bull. This is one of history's most horrific inventions. The brazen bull was a torture device used in ancient Greece around 560 BC. A seaside colony called Ochragus was ruled over by a man named Phalaris. This device was commissioned for him. He wanted to turn torture into music. His court sculpture created this unique nightmarish piece. It was a hollow sculpture of a bull with bells and whistles attached, and there was enough room for the victim to be placed inside of it. The bull would then be placed over a roaring fire, and instead of screams, it was designed to sound like the grunts of a bull. Now, some say this invention was a myth, but famed poet Cicero states that, in fact, the bull did exist and was used. This remains one of the most evil inventions in history.
Coming in at number 3, we have the tricho system. There are plenty of ways to get rid of hair in places you don't want them to be. There's waxing, shaving, electrolysis, but this one invention deserves to be mentioned just one more time before we let history completely forget it. Never do this again. The tricho system was a hair removal device that became a must-have in every salon in the 1920s. And actually worked. It would remove the hair painlessly and effortlessly. All you had to do was sit at a mahogany desk and face a small window. When the flip was switched, there was no burning, just a slight hum from the machine. But it had some horrendous side effects. Yes, it would remove all the hair, but soon men and women would develop cancerous ulcers, carcinoma, and death. The reason? They were using X-ray technology, which is, as we know, radioactive. It would be administered to the skin for a few minutes and require anywhere between 15 to 20 treatments to be effective. X-ray technology was used for a variety of skin treatments around the time and even in the late 1800s, like for ringworm and eczema. But when the tricho machine was released, however, there was no mention of what the technology they were using was. They were just like the tricho miracle. You know, just picture like a typical 1920s ad. And the person administering it wasn't well qualified and didn't know what it was either. They just were like, flip switch, and it works. Clients were just marveled that it worked so well until it slowly burned their faces off. Of course, hindsight is 2020. How they were to know. Let's just put this embarrassing, dangerous blunder to the side, shall we?
In our 2nd spot, we have Agent Orange. This next one we're going to talk about should kind of be remembered so that no one ever does anything so awful ever again. Agent Orange was a pesticide that was responsible for 400,000 fatalities, disabilities, and 500,000 birth defects. It was invented by plant biologist Arthur Galston in 1943. He created it as a way to help accelerate the growth of soybeans in places with a short growing season. But in large doses, it actually destroyed crops, and the US decided to take this technology and abuse it. During the War of Vietnam, they sprayed the land, and 4.5 million acres of crops in Vietnam were destroyed by Agent Orange. And any exposure the Vietnamese and US, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers had to this pesticide came with deadly consequences. It caused an abnormal amount of miscarriages, extreme birth defects, cancer, and skin conditions. Some of the land still can't even be used to this day. It's very tragic and scary. Starting off this countdown, we have the Iron Chair. Imagine the Iron Maiden, but in chair form. Basically, this was a torture device used in the Middle Ages. Victims were placed onto a chair that was filled with hundreds of sharp spikes. There could be anywhere from 500 to 1,500 spikes. They were strapped into the chair, and when their restraints were tightened, the spikes would dig into their flesh. And they often left the victims there for hours, even sometimes days, just suffering. Sometimes there was a hole on the seat, and then a fire was lit below them. But the most common way this chair was used for was actually psychological torture. The victim was often strapped in and then would have to watch another person die in front of them. It was either you confess to your crimes, or you die from the chair, or die another painful death like the person you saw die. This device was used until the late 1800s in Europe. And at number 9, we have the chain smoker, and I'm not talking about the band here. But if you guys are liking this video so far, make sure to give it a big thumbs up because it really helps me out. This invention was created for those who wanted to smoke not 1, not 2, but 20 cigarettes at one time. That is lung cancer just waiting to happen. But it was pretty popular in the mid-20th century. So this invention was bad for a number of reasons. Number 1, cigarettes can kill. Imagine smoking 20 at once. Think about what that would do to your teeth, gums, skin, and lungs. Also, think about how expensive it would be to fuel that addiction. In our 8th spot, we have the breaking wheel. The breaking wheel was an ancient device used to torture and/or kill prisoners. Typically, it was used during public executions. Basically, how this device works is it's a giant wheel with spokes. The person was then strapped to the wheel and then beat, or the wheel was slammed down on them. The most common thing would be having them lay on the wheel, and then the executioner would hit them. Their body was woven between the spokes of the wheel so that when they were hit, their limbs would give away and break. It's really gruesome. Either they were hit until death, or they were just left there after being badly injured to die a slow, painful death. Moving on to number 7, we have the beauty micrometer. This device was basically a way to make you feel really crappy about your appearance. So it was designed in the 1930s and was used as a beauty calibrator to see how beautiful you were and what areas needed more work. And those areas that needed work were where the makeup was applied. The machine itself looked like a medieval torture device with like screws and these weird strips attached to it. The machine itself was made by beautician Max Factor Sr. Yes, a man telling women how to look. Anyways, this machine is terrifying, and its users would often have terrible headaches after wearing this device. Moving on to number 6, we have the lead sprinkler. Back in the day, people were wilding. I swear, they had contests to see who could come up with the most disturbing and gruesome torture devices out there. Like, who the heck thinks of these things? Like this device. So the lead sprinkler was a device that was filled with typically molten lead. But in other cases, it would be filled with tar, boiling oil, or even boiling water. Basically, they just wanted some sort of liquid that would burn the victim's skin right off. So basically, the victim was tied down and then the liquid in the device was sprinkled all over them, typically on their stomach or eyes. If it was poured on the eyes, it would cause the victim to go blind. If they wanted to kill the victim, they would fill the device with molten silver. That would lead to an excruciating pain until their death. So the only sprinkler I want to remember and use is the garden sprinkler. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the tongue terror. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. It was a device used to rip off or cut off a victim's tongue. First, there was a part of the device that would open the victim's mouth nice and wide. It was called the mouth opener. Very creative name, I know. So once their mouth was forced open, the tongue terror would grab the tongue with its grippers. Once it's got a good grip, it was twisted, and this would cause it to become tighter and tighter on the victim's tongue. It took about 3 twists before the tongue would just rip off completely. Yeah, no thank you. I like my tongue the way it is. Coming in at number 4, we have the cement shoes. So this next invention was actually invented by the American Mafia. They would use it to execute their enemies. Basically, it involved placing their victims' feet inside of cinder blocks. They were then filled with wet cement. Once it was dried, they would obviously have cement all around their feet, which is incredibly heavy if you didn't know. They were then tossed into bodies of water like rivers or lakes or even the ocean. And the person would sink right down to the bottom and drown. That way, there was no mess that they had to clean up, and it would be harder for them to find the person's body, unless someone decided to dive deep down to the ocean floor. It's believed that criminals still use this to this day, which is terrifying. There could be hundreds of dead bodies out there that we just haven't found yet. Coming in at number 3, we have the crocodile shears. What's more terrifying than a crocodile, you ask? An alligator. No, I'm just kidding. This invention, known as the crocodile shears. So these were invented and used in late medieval Europe. They were typically used for men that tried to assassinate the king. And dude, this was a brutal form of torture. So this device was made of metal, and it basically was like a big pair of scissors lined with spikes on both ends that looked like crocodile teeth. Now take a guess at where these shears were placed. Right down on the male's private parts. In fact, sometimes they were heated to make it even worse. Then they were just placed down there and closed, so it would snip it right off. I know a bunch of you just flinched. Yeah, I can't imagine how painful that would be. Sometimes the victim would live. Other times, if it struck an artery, they would bleed to death. Moving on to number 2, we have the Spanish tickler. But don't be fooled by the name, okay? This device does anything but tickle you. But can we talk about tickling for a second? Like, that is a messed up form of torture on its own. Like, when you get tickled, it hurts like crazy, but at the same time, it makes you laugh. Like, make up your mind. Is it fun or is it painful? I hate it, okay? Anyways, the Spanish tickler was the set of metal claws that one could slip their hands into. The device often had 3 or 4 claws or sharp curved spikes attached to it. And like I said, it's not used for tickling. Instead, the person wearing it could dig the claws into someone's flesh and then rip it away. It literally was strong enough to tear muscle and flesh right off the victim's bones. This device also came in a variety of sizes and colors. Fun fact. Often, this device wouldn't be used to kill the victim, but instead just leave them severely wounded. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the scavenger's daughter. This next invention is incredibly messed up and brutal. It was created by Sir Leonard Skevington during the reign of Henry VIII. Basically, it was a metal rack that was shaped kind of like in an A. It would then be wrapped around a person in a crouch position. Their head was strapped to the top point of the A, the hands would be at the midpoints, and the legs near the lower ends. The frame would then fold, forcing the person's head to their knees and knees to their head, crushing them into a tiny ball. It would squeeze them so tight until blood would pour out from their nose and ears. Yeah, no thank you. No thank you. And I'm glad that this isn't a thing anymore because it was mainly used for women. In our 9th spot, we have the guillotine. I'm sure you all know about this execution device. If not, pay attention in school, okay? So this consists of a razor-sharp blade attached to a rope. The victim's head was placed in the middle of the frame, and then the blade was dropped. And well, you know, the head would be severed from the rest of the body. At least it was quick and easy. As a result, they considered it to be the most humane method of execution. But still, let's not bring this back, okay? Okay. Moving on to number 8, we have the social credit system. And if you guys are liking this video so far, then make sure to smash that like button. So this next one is literally a Black Mirror episode in real life. Basically, there is a system in the works that will record your behavior and hand out points as a result. They will monitor your online presence as well as your financial wealth and how social you are. The better this all is, then the better your score will be. People then can check those scores like future employers, and those with better scores will do better in society. Believe it or not, but they are already using this in China. They're currently enrolling everyone into a national database and ranking every citizen. Like I said before, this is literally like that one episode from Black Mirror. If you've seen it, then you know exactly what I'm talking about, and you'll also know why it's a bad idea. In our 7th spot today, we have the tub, and I'm not talking about a bathtub. No, this is another torture device used in medieval ages. So this involves placing the convicted person in a wooden tub. Only their head would be sticking out. Their face would then be painted with milk and honey, attracting flies and other insects. They would then feast on the person. You thought that was bad? Well, they would continue to feed the victim, so they would, have to do their business in the bathtub and then sit in their own waste. But eventually, they were basically eaten alive by insects, which is horrifying. In our 6th spot today, we have the automatic tip requester. This next device was invented in 1955 by a man named Russell E. Oakes. It was designed primarily for hotel bellhops. So basically what it is this creepy hand that would strap onto their back. It literally looks like an arm is growing out of their lumbar spine. But anyways, after they helped the guest could then tip the bellhop by putting money on the creepy hand. The money would then fall into a cash box that was also strapped onto the bellhop. Here's the thing though, if the tip was too low, a no sale sign would pop up and inform the tipper that their tip was not enough. Which, I mean, if you ask me, is really embarrassing. Like, imagine tipping someone and they're like, oops, sorry, that's not enough, like we actually need more. So awkward. So I can see why that flopped. Not only that, but the hand on the back just looks really freaking creepy. Like, am I staying at the Haunted Mansion or what? We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the Heretic's Fork. Basically, this was a torture device that consisted of a wrench-type device that was strapped to a victim's neck. Except both ends were super sharp. One end was pushed under the victim's chin, the other against their sternum. They were then strapped in and hung from the ceiling. Now, they had to keep their head up, because if they dropped it, then this device was going into their chest and their throat. So I'll say it so you guys don't have to. Disgusted? Seriously. Ugh. Moving on to number 4, we have the whispering grocery store. Like, this just sounds creepy, and it is. So what if you were out shopping and all of a sudden you heard someone whispering in your ear? Wouldn't that freak you out? Well, companies are trying to make this a thing, where they have ads playing in grocery stores, so when you're looking at a product, the voice will be telling you all the reasons why you should buy that product. That sounds an awful lot like mind control to me. No thank you. Now, a company called the Holosonics has invented something called the Audio Spotlight System. Basically, they are tiny speakers that can be used for this, in-store advertising. But you have to be standing in the right place to hear it. It's not just like a bunch of ads playing at the same time through the grocery store's big PA system. No, that would be hectic. This is just just think of like going to a museum and listening to something that tells you about the piece of art that you're looking at. That's what it is, but 10 times creepier and totally unnecessary. Moving on to number 3, we have coffin torture. Back in the day, people had some sick torture inventions. Seriously, it's like they had fun inventing the most gruesome ways for people to die. This being one of them. Coffin torture involved placing the accused inside a caged coffin. They're locked in so they can't move at all. Sometimes they were even stripped naked before being placed in there. And then they were hung somewhere for everyone to see. The time they were stuck in there depended on their crime. Most were just left there to die, falling victim to dehydration or malnutrition. Some would even be picked to death by birds and insects. And again, they couldn't do anything about it because they were completely immobile. Coming in at number 2, we have the knee splitter. And it's as bad as it sounds. This was another pretty gruesome torture device from the medieval ages. Basically, the device was 2 wood blocks connected by 2 large screws, and it was lined with sharp spikes. This was then placed on the front of the knee and then directly behind. Then it was turned, and the blocks would move closer and closer to each other. Then the sharp metal would just dig deeper and deeper into the flesh. You get it, okay? It would completely destroy the victim's knees, and it would probably be super painful. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the TV that watches you. Technology is getting way too advanced. Like, people need to calm down. Well, Verizon has a patent for this smart TV that watches your every move. It's terrifying. It can detect your movements, sounds, and reactions to what you're watching. It then records it and creates ads that are geared specifically towards you. No thank you. Isn't that terrifying? Like, you won't have any privacy anymore. I swear, you can Google toilet plungers once, and for the next week, all the ads on your computer are gonna be for toilet plungers. It's already intense. But this has gone way too far. Not only that, but like, let's say you and your spouse are fighting while your TV is on. It's gonna detect this and legit start making ads for like couples counseling. I'm not making that up. It's insane. This is too far. Just stop. Just let us watch TV in peace. Starting off this countdown, we have the nose stylus. The fact that this is even a thing is insane. So the nose stylus is just as it sounds. A stylus you put on your nose to use your phone. But it makes you look like a terrifying version of Pinocchio or a freaking plague doctor. Like, I'm sorry, but it looks terrifying. But it's marketed as a way to use your phone hands-free. You just attach this thing onto your nose and you scroll away. I'm sorry, but it just seems like way too much work. I think it's easier for me to just use my hands. Plus, in all the advertisements, it shows the dude having one hand on the phone. So technically, it's not hands-free. The inventor claims that he came up with this idea when he was taking a bath and wanted to use his phone, but didn't want his wet hands to touch his phone. Dude, if you need to use your phone in the bath, then like, that's insane. That's a phone addiction right there. I don't know, I just find this whole thing pointless and also very creepy. Like, come on, that whole thing is nightmare fuel. If I saw someone wearing that, I'd legit think that they were a demon or something. Moving on to number 9, we have the tanning beds. Now, this one probably seems like a weird invention to have on this list, but tanning beds are so bad for us, but people still continue to use them. For a while, people thought that tanning beds were safer than tanning in the sun. Wrong. They're both equally bad. In reality, tanning beds tremendously increase your risk of developing skin cancer. It also causes premature aging, and trust me, no one wants wrinkles. So the UV radiation you're exposed to from tanning beds can promote skin cancer in 2 ways. 1, it damages the DNA in your skin cells, which can cause the skin to grow abnormally and cause benign or malignant growths to develop. Or 2, it can weaken the body's immune system, which affects the body's natural defenses against cancer cells. The most dangerous form of skin cancer is melanoma. It accounts for most of the deaths due to skin cancer each year. Hence why tanning beds are not a smart invention. Like, it slowly kills you after every use. Moving on to number 8, we have the Roman candle. This is considered one of the most brutal methods of torture in the ancient world. So first, the unlucky victim would be tied to a stake and then nailed to it. Then they were covered in flammable liquid and set on fire. Hence why they were called the Roman candle. They were literally turned into human candles. This was a slow and painful way to go. Emperor Nero was known for using this as his preferred method of execution. In fact, he would use his victims literally as torches for his garden parties. Yeah, you heard me. This dude used real-life people to light up his garden. That's just sick and incredibly twisted. In our 7th spot today, we have the 3D printed death machine. Recently, a man named Dr. Philip Nitschke announced he created a 3D printed death machine known as the Sarco, short for the sarcophagus. Basically, it's a way for people to take their own lives. Literally, I'm not making this up. Who the hell would even think of creating such a thing? Obviously this guy. Anyways, the person would willingly climb into the device and slowly it would suck out all the oxygen in there so that they would slip unconscious and then die. He said it's a way to take people's lives more peacefully. But not everyone can use this device. Apparently, people that have been deemed mentally fit and have a legit reason for wanting to die can only use it. Obviously, it's a very, very controversial invention. Coming in at number 6, we have the mass shaving machine. And this invention is exactly what it sounds like. This was popular back in the 19th century. It allowed barbers to shave 12 men at the exact same time. This device would first coat everyone's face with shaving cream or whatever they used back then, and then there was a blade hooked onto it, and it would go and shave the men's face. No, just know, everyone has different face shapes. That blade could come down and slice your face or something. I'm just glad it isn't around today. I know everyone wants efficiency, but this invention could go wrong for a number of reasons. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the flatulence filtering underwear. This one has got to be the weirdest one on this list. Basically, if you're a person that has really bad gas, don't worry. This underwear has got you covered. Basically, if you toot, the underwear somehow filters it so no odor comes out. No, I'm sorry, that's just weird as heck. Please, let's not make this a thing. Next thing you know, a company is gonna come out with like underwear that makes your farts smell like things, like strawberries or marshmallows. I don't need this becoming a trend, okay? Like, ooh, who has the best farts? No. Moving on to number 4, we have the creeping baby. If dolls creep you out, then you would not be a fan of this invention at all. In 1871, a man named George P. Clark invented this doll baby thing. His goal was to make a doll that crawls exactly how a baby does. But boy, did it turn out really creepy. So the doll's head, arms, and legs were made out of painted plaster. From there, they were hinged onto a brass clockwork body. The doll then moves forward by rolling along on 2 toothed wheels. But honestly, it just looks like a creepy robot baby. So not only is this doll terrifying looking, but it can slowly creep along. Yeah, no, just no. Let's just leave it in the past. No, thank you. In our 3rd spot, we have the revolver camera. Again, it's just as it sounds. Basically, it was a gun that would take a picture when you pull the trigger. Yeah, you heard me correctly. It was meant to take a photo exactly when the bullet hit the target. Okay, but don't worry, there were no bullets in the camera when they took the photos. Basically, in around 1938, this device was created. A tiny camera was attached to the underside of the barrel and the front of the trigger guard. It was attached so that every time the trigger was pulled, it would snap a photo. Now, there's no evidence that this gun was actually used. They only used it for trial photo shoots. And like I said, it was used without bullets. Or so that's what historians assume. Sadly, we don't know much about this invention and its purpose. Was someone trying to make something cool? Or did they want to take photos of their victims? Either way, that would be super bad to bring back. You can imagine why. Like, here, let me take your photo, and then everyone screams and runs away. Moving on to number 2, we have the thumb screws. This was a common form of interrogation used in medieval Europe. If the criminal was not behaving or giving the information that they wanted, then they would resort to using this device. Basically, it was a vise that would clamp down on a person's thumbs or fingers. Then the vise was slowly tightened, putting more and more pressure on the person's thumbs. Also, they were locked in place with a padlock, so they couldn't escape. They were left there until they made a confession. If not, their fingers were shattered. And in our number 1 spot, we have the head crusher. Just the sound of this invention alone is gnarly, and it's pretty self-explanatory. The device was basically a vice for the head. I know, it's gross. So basically, it was a metal device that hooked onto a person's jaw and then head. Then the executioner would twist the handle and it would push the head and jaw together. And then you get it. I'm telling you, there were some pretty sick people back in the day. They had fun with torture. On top of that, some versions of this device had a little thing at the front to catch the victim's eyeballs when they popped out. Yum. Starting off this countdown, we have the smile mask. In the wake of World War I, Budapest, Hungary saw a lot of their residents take their own lives. One way they thought they could handle this problem was through smile school. Yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like. It started as a joke by Professor Gino and a hypnotist named Binkso, but then it actually turned into a real-life thing. Basically, it was a school that taught everyone about smiles and analyzed different people's smiles, like the Mona Lisa smile. One thing that they invented at the school was the smile mask. It was given to people with depression to wear and was believed to cure it. Basically, it was like a card with a painted smile on it that was then strapped to your face. It was thought that just by wearing a fake smile, it would automatically cure your depression. But in reality, it looks terrifying, like some sort of torture device from the Saw movies. I don't think this worked. If anything, it would have made the depression worse. Like, who wants to walk around wearing that 24/7?